Part 30. The regent is a yandere who needs to be pampered. Author, Nan Huang. Chapter 291. Empress Chen didn't say anything and sat down by the bed. The maid knelt down to undress and take off her shoes. She actually didn't have much hostility towards the sudden return of Princess Feng. At her age, her competitiveness was no longer so strong. After dealing with the concubines who came and went in the harem for half her life, she originally thought that Lin Lao would be the last one. The winner, but he didn't expect that he would not be able to compete for destiny in the end. Mammy's words briefly aroused a bit of unwillingness in her heart, but that bit of unwillingness was fleeting. No matter how many complaints she had in private, no matter how much dissatisfaction she felt in her heart, the priest's hall was the soul of the Dongling royal family, and no one could and went against the priest's house. Not even the emperor dares to rebel, let alone all the other living beings who submit to the imperial power. After undressing and lying on the bed, Queen Chen said, "That's all, the emperor is not in good spirits. There are some things that I can only share with him. When Princess Feng completes the enthronement ceremony and chooses the emperor's husband, I will abdicate with the emperor. It's time to take care of yourself in the palace, let the younger generation take care of other things." Upon hearing this, the personal maid smiled and said, "The queen is tolerant and generous. It would be great if King Wei could be so tolerant." "So what if you can't look away?" Empress Chen closed her eyes and said in a slightly tired voice, "He can't go against the imperial power or the priesthood by himself. Take your time, as time goes by, you can think about it." Yes. The personal maid tucked the quilt for her, told the two maids on duty to keep a close watch, then turned and walked out. Nan 11 slept until midnight and woke up. Very few people in the palace could sleep until this hour. The emperor had to go to court early and had to get up before dawn. The concubines in the harem had to greet the queen early in the morning, so they naturally got up early, changed clothes and freshened up, and went to the queen's palace early to wait. The princes have morning classes when they are young, and they have government affairs when they become adults. The princesses have to learn music, chess, calligraphy, and painting, and in short they have to get up early. The other palace servants had to serve the master, and of course they couldn't sleep until they woke up naturally. Therefore, even if they are rich and beautiful, few people can really do whatever they want. They are always bound by rules and shackles, preventing them from being free. In principle, Nan 11 is no exception. It's just that she is protected by Rong Yu, who has supported her and given her the power to do whatever she wants to the maximum extent. In addition, she is pregnant now and the weather is cold. Rong Yu will deliberately let her do it when she wakes up. She slept a little longer, as if she didn't realize the responsibilities that the prince had at all, and only pampered her like some kind of animal whose limbs were not working hard. At this moment, this industrious animal was sitting in front of the dressing table, looking at the beauty wrapped like a rice dumpling in the mirror. "Where did Rong Yu go?" "My slave is not sure." Yunya combed her hair carefully. The prince said to let the master sleep a little longer. "He will come as soon as he goes." Nan 11 hummed and didn't ask any more questions. In the outer hall, Zi Yiling and Yuetong led several maids to stand respectfully. Each of the maids held a jade plate in their hands. On the jade plate were the clothes, belts, accessories, headdresses to be worn today. Your Highness. Nanny Su walked into the hall and reported respectfully, "Princess Wan from Prince Wei's palace, Princess Dan from Prince Huai's palace, Miss Chiu from Prince Jing's palace, and Princess Willing from Huainan palace are here." Nan 11 was slightly surprised and subconsciously turned her head to look out the window. The sun was shining brightly and the weather was clear. It looked like a good day, but they came so early. As if he could see what she was thinking, Yunyu said with a smile, "These ladies are meeting the master for the first time. The master asked them to come and play today yesterday. Naturally, they came here early. We can't let the master wait for them, right? Due to the status gap here, Even a well-intentioned invitation is equivalent to a summons. Nan 11 doesn't care about etiquette, but it doesn't mean that the person being summoned dares to have a negligent attitude. Nan 11 was silent for a moment. The king of Waynan is. The king of Waynan is a prince who has a fiefdom. This time he came back with his 2 children to see His Highness Princess Feng. He should wait until His Highness ascends the throne before leaving. Nanny Su said, adding in time, the girl who asked His Highness at the palace banquet last night if she could speak to the Prince Regent was Princess Wiling, the daughter of King Huainan. Nan 11 thought of the little girl last night and smiled lightly. In that case, let them come in. Yes, Nanny Su agreed, and then hesitantly asked for instructions. Your Highness, will you go to the Queen of Viang Palace to pay her respects later? Greetings. Nan 11 was stunned and thought to herself, she really hadn't paid any serious greetings to anyone. Has the Queen summoned you? Aunt Su said, no. Nan 11 pondered for a moment. When does the Queen usually get up? The Queen's health has not been very good recently. She may have just woken up now. Nanny Su said, if your Highness is free today, just go and sit with the Queen. There is no need to get up early to pay her respects. To put it bluntly, Princess Feng has a distinguished status. Unlike the concubines in the harem, the Queen is just an elder to her, so naturally she will not deliberately embarrass her. She only needs to do her best to say hello as a junior. Of course, if she doesn't want to, the Queen can't do anything to her. Yes, Nan 11 nodded, I will take a look at it later. Yes. Nanny Su turned around and walked out. Nan 11 was dressing up in the inner hall. After changing her clothes and going out, she saw 4 girls standing in the hall. When Nan 11 came out, the 4 of them saluted her respectfully. See Princess Feng. No need to be polite, Nan 11 said in a gentle tone, the weather is nice today. Let's go for a walk in the East Palace garden. Yes. 5 girls of the same age walked out together. The pretty little girl in apricot palace dress said softly, Princess Feng, why don't you see the regent? Nan 11 turned to look at her and saw that she looked innocent. Her watery eyes were full of expectation. The corners of her lips couldn't help but rise. Are you here to see me or the regent? Of course, I'm here to see you. Princess Xianyuan Swiling climbed her arm with a cute expression, but who made the regent look so good? Everyone loves beauty, but please rest assured, Princess, I swear to God that I have no improper thoughts about the regent. Window. Tabula equals window. Tabula. Tabula.push, mode, thumbs feed -01, container, tabula below article thumbnail -300x250, placement, below article thumbnail -300x250, target. Type, mix. The regent is a yandere who needs to be pampered. Author, Nan Huang. Chapter 292. Nan 11 smiled lightly, I am not worried about your intentions. Why? Xueling was puzzled, and questions appeared in her beautiful eyes, because the princess sister doesn't care that he is liked by other girls. My prince is good looking. Isn't it normal for girls to like him? Nan 11 said calmly, as if she didn't think this was a problem, but he has become my husband. No matter how much others like him, he can't get it, right? You're right, everyone has a love for beauty, and I can't stop others from liking him, so what should I care about? Xueling wrinkled her nose, then the princess isn't worried that the regent will fall in love with another girl. Don't worry, Nan 11 smiled lightly, he is destined to be unable to escape from my grasp in this life. Xianyuan Swiling shook his head, but I have heard many people say that men's sweet words are the most unreliable. They are used to having 3 wives and 4 concubines. Even if they like someone, it will not last a lifetime. Over time, they will change their mind. Our daughter, no matter how beautiful your family is, they can only keep it for a few years. When they no longer look so good, they will like younger and more beautiful girls. Little Princess Wiling Xianyuanjia frowned and interrupted her softly, Princess Feng and the regent have a very good relationship. Don't say these things in front of the princess. What those people said may not necessarily be true. Really, it's not like there are no good men in this world who are worthy of trust. Xueling pouted her lips and said innocently, I didn't say anything. Men in this world are naturally lustful. Besides, the regent has a high position and has a lot of power. It's normal to have 3 wives and 4 concubines. You see, besides my mother and concubine, my father is the king, there are 2 concubines, and several concubines. Isn't Prince Jing the same? A princess, a concubine, and a concubine. In short, how many of those noble men can do it all? Eventually. This is not normal, unless there is something else. Unless you have other plans. Nan 11 smiled casually, you worry too much. Xueling seemed a little anxious, Sister Princess, don't you believe me? Everything I say is true. I don't believe you. Nan 11 smiled faintly, always in a calm tone. Men in the world are indeed used to having 3 wives and 4 concubines, and there are relatively few who can do it, but that doesn't mean there are none. Xianyuansuiling bit her lip, what if the regent also changes his mind? He won't. Nan 11 said calmly, I believe him. Xianyuansuiling frowned, as if he wanted to say something more, but when the words came to his lips, he just said softly, then, will the regent of Great Zhou be willing to marry Dongling? As soon as these words came out, the expressions of the other women changed slightly, and their eyes instantly fell on Nan 11's face. Last night at the family banquet, Princess Feng showed her domineering attitude and stood up to all the royal family members. Although not many people actually spoke up to embarrass her, the fact is that Her Royal Highness the Princess was calm in front of all the royal family members and elders. Not losing any momentum, she firmly defended her husband and finally won a complete victory. But what they talked about most last night was the marriage between the 2 countries. They also mentioned that the regent was Princess Feng's consort and would be Her Majesty the Queen's only royal husband in the future. However, no one ever asked whether the regent was really so she married into Dongling. As a daughter raised in a boudoir, they were exposed to music, chess, calligraphy, and painting the most, and heard the 3 obediences and 4 virtues the most. Of course, they were not ignorant about the generals in charge of the military. That was a prince with real power, and the regent's status was inherently more valuable than an ordinary prince. Before the emperor took real power, he could even be above the emperor. They heard clearly at last night's family dinner that the regent still held the power of 400,000 soldiers and horses, such a noble and aloof man, willing to put aside his pride and debase himself to become a subordinate of a woman? Just now Xueling said that unless he had other motives, could it be that he really had other motives? In Dazhu, I married Rong Yu, and I was his princess. Nan 11 said calmly, in Dongling, if I really become the queen, he will be my royal husband. I and him, no one is superior to anyone, and no one has to rely on anyone. If there is such a weak character like me, he will be more protected by him, so these problems you are worried about do not exist. Her voice was gentle and calm, but it was a little different from the leisurely tone just now. It seemed to reveal a touch of majesty, making people involuntarily shudder. Xianyuansuiling was completely mute, and the other 3 girls were also silent. Yunyu, who was following a few people, curled her lips and secretly thought that she dared to show off her skills in front of her master. Do you really think that Princess Feng, who just returned from the Great Zhou dynasty, is a stupid and ignorant girl? The daughter of the king of Huainan. Yunyu secretly noted this person, turned her head to look at Yinshuang, and whispered softly, I'll check this Huainan king later. He must have bad intentions. Xianyuansuiling looked innocent, but in fact she had a wealthy heart, but she was just pretending to be a good person. However, since she was a wealthy woman, she would certainly not be stupid enough to deliberately provoke Princess Feng. Someone must have given her instructions behind her. Yin's Huang nodded. At this time of year, the plum blossoms in the garden are in full bloom, and the air is filled with subtle fragrance and a refreshing breath. Nan 11 walked slowly along the garden path and was about to walk into the garden when suddenly there was a sound of footsteps outside the garden, and then a familiar voice sounded, "Princess Feng." Nan 11 stopped and turned around, seeing Chu Hongii coming quickly. Chu Hongii soon arrived in front of her and bowed slightly. There was a little conflict in the military camp outside the city. Princess Feng needs to deal with it personally. Conflict? Nan 11 frowned. Are you talking about the Great Zhou Suanjia army and the Dongling army? Yes. What happened? The cause of the incident is not clear yet, Chu Hongii said. I am worried that the matter will get out of hand, so I came to report to the princess first. The regent has gone there. Nan 11 frowned, turned around and told the two maids to entertain the little princesses first, and then said to Chu Hongii, in this case, let's go. Master Yin Shuang said lightly, the prince can handle it, and the master does not need to take risks. Nan 11 glanced at her and shook his head slowly, you go with me, I can't let Rongyu fight alone. After that, he followed Chu Hongii out without any hesitation. Chu Hongii came to tell her about this matter in person, not only because she was a woman and it was convenient for her to enter and exit the East Palace, but also indicated that the situation should be serious. Rongyu naturally had a way to deal with the problems in the military camp, but he was in Dongling at this time, and his every move was under everyone's attention. No matter who was to blame for the cause of the incident, it was not easy to deal with it. If he sided with the soldiers of the Great Zhou, he would have a reputation of protecting his shortcomings. But if he punished his subordinates, it would make people think that he was afraid of trouble, and even chill the hearts of the soldiers of the Great Zhou. The crown prince left the palace with a big scene. Nan 11 and Chu Hongii sat in the carriage together. After leaving the palace, they heard Chu Hongii explain, the one who clashed with the Suanjia army was the Obsidian army brought back by the Prince of Huainan. Nan 11 frowned, Prince of Huainan. No wonder Chu Hongii came to report, because the army that clashed was not under Chu Hongii's jurisdiction, so even if she rushed to the military camp, she could not handle the matter, and could only tell Nan 11. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. The regent is a yandere who needs to be pampered. Author, Nan Huang. Chapter 293. Nan 11 frowned slightly. What does the Prince of Huainan want to do? What is the temperament and strength of the Prince of Huainan? The Prince of Huainan, Xianyuan Sheng, ranks 5th among the current princes. 20 years ago, he was the first military commander of Dongling and the only prince who led troops as a prince. Chu Hongii said lightly, when the emperor established the crown prince, he also named the 5th prince as the Prince of Huainan. He led troops to garrison the border of Huainan, enjoyed a fiefdom of 2,000 miles, and commanded 200,000 troops at the border. He was a prince that people feared. After a pause, however, the court has always had regulations that princes with fiefdoms cannot return to the capital without the emperor's call, so the Prince of Huainan has not returned many times after guarding the border. His 2 children grew up in Huainan, and many people in the imperial capital don't know much about this young prince. Nan 11 hummed, thinking. With his fiefdom and military power, the king of Huainan is obviously more important than the princes who stayed in the imperial capital. He holds great power. For the sake of the stability of the country, it is normal that he is not allowed to return to the capital without authorization. However, it can be seen from this that the emperor is not very partial to him. Perhaps it is more likely that he believes in the ability of this prince, so he is willing to give him military power, but he was unwilling to let him stay in the imperial capital at that time, so as not to pose a threat to the crown prince's position. Being the only one among the princes with military power, this person should not be an impulsive and troublesome person. Moreover, he has been away from the imperial city to guard Huainan for 20 years. As he grows older, as long as nothing unexpected happens, this prince should be more stable and profound, and know how to be low-key and cautious. However, his son made trouble as soon as he returned to the capital. Nan 11 was silent, thinking that something was a bit strange. The carriage went out of the city and went straight to the military camp on the outskirts of the city. At this time, on the huge parade ground of the West Camp, the two armies faced each other, with a cold and fierce momentum, and the air was tense, revealing a breath of imminent explosion. Outside the parade ground, there was a crowd of people, most of them were soldiers in armor, but the difference in clothing and color could tell which person they belonged to at a glance. On one side of the parade ground was the great Zhou Suanjia army, led by Ling Fan, all dressed in black uniforms, holding red tasseled spears, standing solemnly. Opposite them, led by a handsome young man in white robes, 2,000 soldiers in silver-white armor also held sharp spears, ready to go, with a fierce and intimidating momentum, making people afraid. Regent Rongyu sat silently on the horse, his noble face glowing with a cold and indifferent luster. I heard that the regent of the Great Zhou is brave and good at fighting, and is a legend on the battlefield. This prince has admired him for a long time. The young man in white robe has an overly handsome face, fair skin, and a slim figure. The whole person looks out of place in this solemn and cold military camp. However, his beautiful eyes are stained with a bit of evil spirit, and the corners of his lips also raise a hint of rebellious arc. I wonder how the regent plans to deal with this situation today. Rongyu looked at him with cold eyes and no emotion. The young man in white robe pursed his lips slightly, and said lightly with the pressure of numbing scalp, "This prince wants to personally experience the skills of the regent. I wonder if the regent is willing to give me this opportunity." "This king has always had a rule for governing the army," Rongyu said indifferently. "If there is trouble in the military camp, no matter what the reason is, it will be dealt with according to military law." The handsome young man in white robe twitched his back, and his hand holding the reins tightened imperceptibly, and he kept silent. "This king gives you two choices," Rongyu said indifferently. "First, all the soldiers who participated in the incident will be punished with 30 military sticks each, and you two commanders will be punished together. Second, the military law will be exempted for others, and only you two commanders will be punished, and each will be punished with 80 military sticks." As soon as these words came out, the whole parade ground seemed to be silent in an instant. The soldiers of the Great Zhou dynasty have always been afraid of Rongyu's strict military management. Naturally, they dare not have any ideas at this time. No matter who is to blame for the cause of the incident, no matter whether such a treatment is reasonable or not, they will not be dissatisfied with a word. The dongling soldiers surrounding the parade ground were surprised. They were not shocked by the treatment method of the Great Zhou regent, but the surprise brought by his words at this time. The Prince of Huainan has been stationed in Huainan with his father and rarely returns to Beijing. As the only legitimate son of the King of Huainan, this little prince grew up in the military camp since he was a child, which is completely different from the noble son who grew up in the imperial city. Don't be fooled by his beautiful appearance, handsome and gentle appearance. It is said that he is very skilled in spearmanship. Due to his special status, the royal nobles in Dongling have no right to hold him accountable, let alone the regent from Dezhou. Who dares to punish him easily except the emperor and his father? The regent of Dezhou, Rongyu, just came to Dongling on the second day, and he was going to implement military law on him. This is simply impossible. If I win you, you will be punished obediently. Rongyu's eyes fell on the face of the young man in white robes. If I lose, I will also accept 80 military sticks as a punishment for my poor command of my subordinates. The generals and soldiers heard this and understood. It turned out that 80 military sticks were not just a punishment for the Prince of Huainan, but more like a price to pay after accepting defeat. In other words, if the Prince of Waynan wanted to challenge the regent of Dezhou, he had to agree to this condition. But the price seems a little high. The wooden sticks used in military law are all solid and heavy mahogany, and 10 strokes will make ordinary men unable to get up. The men in the military camp are physically strong, so their endurance is naturally stronger than that of ordinary weak scholars, but even so, the range of punishment is mostly between 30 and 50, depending on the severity of the crime. A military stick of 30 can make a person lie on the bed, a military stick of 50 can make a person unable to get up for 10 days or half a month, and if it is hit hard, it is possible that the muscles and bones will be injured and the person will lie on the bed for a month. After a military stick of 80, it is hard to say whether he can survive. The white-robed young man pursed his lips and looked at Rong Yu silently for a long time, then slowly raised a wild and unruly arc. This prince agrees. As soon as the voice fell, the expressions of the soldiers changed slightly. Agreed. This means that the Prince of Waynan accepted this way of sparring. If he lost, he was willing to accept the military stick in front of so many people? What if he won? The dissatisfaction of the soldiers is caused by the commander. So this prince accepts the second way of handling. All the punishments shall be borne by the commander, and the others shall be exempted from punishment. Qian Yuanyao raised his eyebrows, with a somewhat arrogant expression. If this prince wins, please ask the regent and General Ling to take 80 military sticks each. If this prince loses, he will also take the blame and will never deny it. All the soldiers present today will bear witness. Window. Tabula equals window. Tabula. Tabula.push, mode, thumbs feed -01, container, tabula below article thumbnail -300x250, placement, below article thumbnail -300x250, target. Type, mix. The regent is a yandere who needs to be pampered. Author, Nan Huang. Chapter 294. After the words fell, the whole army fell silent. The confidant general behind him frowned and said anxiously, "My lord, you must not do this. How can the prince, with his wealth and body, easily take risks? Almost everyone in the world knows that the regent of the great Zhou dynasty is a legend on the battlefield. He led the army to go on an expedition at the age of 14. Even the northern Xinjiang cavalry, which was considered brutal and tough at that time, was defeated by him. This shows that his strength is extraordinary. Although the prince is diligent in martial arts training on weekdays, he has no trouble arranging troops and formations, and his marksmanship makes people feel inferior, but against the regent of the great Zhou dynasty, no one can predict the success or failure. If it's an ordinary sparring match, that's it. Winning or losing is just a matter of face, but if it's at the expense of military law, it's undoubtedly frightening. If we really lose, the 80-year army stick will kill us. How can a man go back on his word even if he keeps his promise? Xian Yuanyao said in a cold tone, "You don't have to worry. If I lose today and receive the 80 armed staff, it means that my skills are inferior to others. It has nothing to do with anyone. You are not allowed to do it for this reason. Provoke a hostile melee between the two armies. Do you hear me clearly?" The expressions of all the soldiers behind him changed dramatically. "Your Majesty." Xian Yuanyao's tone suddenly turned cold. "Did you hear that?" The soldiers were stunned and all responded, "Yes." As soon as the words fell, the two opposing armies retreated in an orderly manner like a tide, leaving a spacious place for Xian Yuanyao and Rong Yu to compete. The school grounds were solemn, full of thunderous atmosphere. Rong Yu wore a black gold-woven brocade robe and sat on a maroon horse. His face was dignified and cold, and Zhou Sheng exuded a natural nobility. Xian Yuanyao was dressed in a white robe, sitting on the back of a white horse without saying a word, holding the rein in his left hand and a gun in his right hand. His handsome face was as straight as jade, and he had a somewhat aloof and rebellious air from the corners of his slightly raised eyes. Two tall war horses faced each other in silence. Bang! 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 The sound of gongs and drums sounded, and the atmosphere on the school grounds suddenly became solemn and tense, and the air was filled with an intimidating atmosphere that was about to explode. Suddenly there was a neighing sound. The hearts of all the soldiers were shaken, and their eyes were fixed on the 2 horses and 2 coaches on the school field for a moment, for fear of missing any wonderful moment. The white horse took the lead and raised its hooves, rushing towards Rongyu like lightning. The spear in the hand of the young man in white robes emitted a sharp light in everyone's sight, as if it was carrying a thunderous wind, and rushed towards Rongyu fiercely. Yu attacked and left. Bang! Rongyu leaned aside and suddenly raised the reins. The horse under him neighed and turned around. The sharp sword at his waist was unsheathed. The sparks from the clash between the sword and the spear made people feel chilly. The force of the weapons striking each other was shocking. Xian Yuanyao's tiger's mouth was numb, and the spear almost came out of his hand. He quickly grasped the barrel of the gun and rode back. Rongyu drew his sword and turned around. Without waiting for Xian Yuanyao to react, the long sword like a dragon rushed towards the young man in white at lightning speed. The frost was as cold as snow, the sword was like a white rainbow, and there were cold rays of light, as bright as a sword. The speed was so fast that it was almost blinding. The cold sword energy mixed with the strong wind like scraping bones, brushed across the cheek and caused waves of pain like daggers. The young man in white robe suddenly raised his gun to respond, but his moves were already embarrassing. The dark pupils raised slightly, facing those clear eyes. The young man in white was slightly shocked, and a sharp numb pain came from the tiger's mouth. The spear came out of his hand. He grabbed the reins urgently to prevent himself from being thrown off the horse. The spear fell to the ground, and the victory or defeat was determined. The so-called competition is more like a crushing competition in terms of strength. From start to finish, it only takes a moment. There was a dead silence in the barracks. The officers and soldiers of the great Zhou dynasty, led by Ling Fan, looked as usual and did not cheer for Rongyu's victory. Obviously, such a result was expected by them. Their prince had created the myth of being undefeated on the battlefield when he was a boy. How could anyone challenge him if he wanted to? The competition is a competition of equal strength. Today's competition was just an expected crushing defeat. Compared with their calmness, the expressions on the faces of the Dongling soldiers were obviously not good-looking, especially those of the Huainan army, all of whom had earth-colored faces and dull expressions, staring blankly at the scene in front of them. Rongyu said nothing and looked at the young man in white robe without saying a word. Xian Yuanyao seemed to be unfazed. He calmly turned over and dismounted, and said calmly, "My prince is willing to admit defeat and let the regent do whatever he wants." It was as if the Huainan army had woken up from a dream, and they all turned pale with shock. "You can't do that, Your Majesty." Xian Yuanyao turned to look at the soldiers under his command, and raised his eyebrows slightly. "Do you want me to break my promise and become a person who breaks my promise?" The soldiers were speechless. Rongyu raised his hand to signal. A soldier in the army came over carrying a military staff. The faces of the Dongling soldiers turned pale, and they had 80 military staffs. The Prince of Huainan followed his father to Beijing to report on his duties and meet the new crown prince to witness the coronation ceremony of Her Majesty the Queen. If he received the heavy responsibility of the military staff today, Huainan, who loves his son eagerly, will the king be angry? How should the emperor explain this? "Your Excellency, Prince Regent," a general who was watching from the outside of the school grounds hurried over and bowed slightly. Prince Yao came back to the capital with King Huainan to report on his duties. He was summoned. King Huainan was currently in the palace. "I don't know anything about what happened in the military camp. If the regent handles Prince Yao without authorization, I'm afraid it won't be easy to explain to the emperor later, so please think twice." He was a general under Chu Hongii. He didn't have to get involved in the affairs between Rongyu and Xian Yuanyao. It was the style of a military general to be willing to accept defeat. A general promised a large sum of money, and there was no room for people who were greedy for life and afraid of death in the military camp. But Xian Yuanyao's identity is so special that he has to be treated with caution. Rong Yu looked down at him, his expression showed no joy or anger, and his voice was cold and cold. Xian Yuanyao, you say. This prince has just said that he is willing to accept the loss of the bet. Why are you still talking here? Xian Yuanyao frowned and looked at the young general who came to plead with displeasure. This prince doesn't often go back to Beijing, so I don't know your identity, but a man's words are as good as gold, and if you break your promise, how can you convince the public in the future? The general who was pleading didn't know what to do when he heard it, and he could only say in embarrassment, if the king of Huainan is angry. 80 military sticks are too heavy, and people feel scared just by hearing it. If someone is beaten to a bad state, the king of Huainan will lose his beloved son and lose control of his rage. I'm afraid I don't know what he will do. Don't forget that Princess Feng has just returned to Dongling. If the king of Huainan turns against him because of this regent of the Great Zhou, the consequences will be absolutely unimaginable. I will send someone to explain this matter to my father. Xian Yuanyao said calmly. Today I willingly made a bet with the regent and will not vent my anger on others. But just at this moment, a loud voice sounded outside the military camp. Princess Feng is here. The sound of the carriage came from far away, and all the soldiers in the military camp turned their heads and looked at the gorgeous carriage escorted by hundreds of imperial guards. The regent is a yandere who needs to be pampered. Author, Nan Huang. Chapter 295. The carriage arrived at the military camp and stopped outside the parade ground. Tens of thousands of soldiers in the military camp watched the carriage coming from afar in silence. Their eyes swept past the imperial guards escorting the carriage and saw Chu Hong'ai, who was the first to walk out of the carriage. Yin Yu and Yin Shuang opened the curtain and carefully helped Nan 11, who was wearing a mink cloak, walk down. The military camp was as quiet as snow. Chu Hong'ai swept her cold eyes and said in a cold and hard voice, Her Highness Princess Feng has come to the Huban West camp. Why are you still standing? Don't you know you have to salute? As soon as the voice fell, Chu Hong'ai's Huban soldiers knelt down, and the voices of thousands of people paying homage at the same time shook the sky. Greetings to Her Highness Princess Feng, may your Highness live 1,000 years and 1,000 years. Then, the great Zhou soldiers led by Ling Fan knelt on one knee on the parade ground. Greetings to the Regent Princess, may your Highness live 1,000 years and 1,000 years and 1,000 years. The great Zhou soldiers performed the great Zhou rituals, and Nan 11 was the regent princess of the great Zhou. There was nothing wrong with that. Several generals led by the Huainan army looked at Xian Yuanyao. The young prince in white robes looked at the face of the new Princess Feng of Dongling, and a strange light flashed in his eyes. He raised his hand and waved lightly. Several trusted generals immediately knelt on one knee after receiving the order. Greetings to Her Royal Highness Princess Feng, may Her Royal Highness live 1,000 years and 1,000 years. The military might in the military camp was so impressive and awe-inspiring that people could not help but feel palpitations. This was the soldier who defended his country, with a strong character and awe-inspiring aura. Nan 11 did not speak, his eyes slowly swept across the huge military camp square, looking at the wide training ground where the three armies gathered, and walked forward step by step with Chu Hong'ai, Yin Yu and Yin Shuang following closely. As they approached the parade ground, Rong Yu flew down and soon came to her. Why are you here? I heard that there was a conflict in the military camp. I was worried that you would be embarrassed, so I came to see you. Nan 11 smiled gently. What's going on? Rong Yu raised his lips slightly. If I can't even handle this matter, how can I gain a foothold in Dongling in the future? Nan 11 whispered, Isn't it because I'm afraid that you will be embarrassed? Rong Yu couldn't help wanting to hug her in his arms, but considering so many people, he finally held back and only took her waist and rushed to the parade ground with her. His voice was light, Xian Yuan Yao, meet Princess Feng. The young man in white robe stared at Nan 11 silently. Nan 11 also saw the Prince of Huainan up close. The first impression she had was that the prince was quite handsome and had a rare good appearance. However, before she could take a closer look, the young man had already closed his eyes and knelt on one knee. Your Highness Xian Yuan Yao, I pay my respects to Princess Feng. Nan 11 seemed to have not expected him to be so obedient, and could not help but raise her eyebrows and smiled faintly. Please stand up, my lord. No need to stand up, Rong Yu said indifferently. Come here, serve with military sticks. After the voice fell, the whole place was silent. What military stick? Nan 11 looked at him in surprise. If there is trouble in the military camp, it should be dealt with according to the rules of the army. Rong Yu's voice was very light. Xian Yuan Yao and Ling Fan, each will be punished with 80 strokes of the stick. Nan 11 was silent. 80 strokes of the stick? Chu Hong Ai, who was standing aside, frowned slightly and looked at the young man in white robe who was kneeling on one knee on the ground thoughtfully, and felt that the current situation was a little beyond her expectations. However, 80 strokes of the military stick were too heavy, so she had to speak up. Please think twice, Regent. 80 strokes of the military stick is too heavy. The Prince of Huainan. He is willing to accept the loss. Rong Yu's voice was cold and hard, as if there was no room for negotiation. No one needs to say more. Chu Hong Ai shut up immediately. Rong Yu's eyes turned slightly and fell on the 4 people holding the military sticks. His voice was like frost. What are you still standing there for? Do it. The 4 people holding the military sticks stood up and walked over. Xian Yuan Yao said nothing, silently adjusted his posture, supported his hands on the ground, slightly straightened his back, and got into a posture to be punished. Ling Fan posed in the same posture without saying a word. Rong Yu did not order people to drag the stool over, so naturally they did not need to lie down to be punished, but the 2 were generals in the army after all, and they needed to maintain the most basic dignity in front of so many soldiers. Therefore, they had to adjust themselves to a posture that they could withstand and not be embarrassed as much as possible. Regent, the first general of the Tiger Guard army, raised his eyes in a hurry. Please show mercy, Regent. Please show mercy, Regent. The general of the Huainan army also spoke, his tone anxious. Today's matter was our recklessness. I am willing to bear it with the prince, and each of us will receive 30 strokes. Please approve it, Regent. I am willing to bear 30 military strokes. We are all willing to bear 30 military strokes. The prince has already made a promise and is willing to accept defeat. The Huainan army did not dare to shout at Rong Yu at this time. Firstly, the punishment that Xian Yuan Yao was about to bear was his own will, and it was the result of his defeat after challenging Rong Yu. Secondly, Princess Feng was also there. Although they were not familiar with Princess Feng and were not really convinced in their hearts, they were not stupid enough to offend the Crown Prince of Dongling in this situation and cause more trouble to their own prince and prince. So they could only settle for the second best and share as much as possible to reduce the punishment that the prince should receive. Your Highness, the Deputy General of the Great Joseonjia Army took a step forward, knelt on one knee, and spoke respectfully. I am willing to share the punishment of General Ling. I am willing to share it. I am willing to do it. Your Highness, please allow me. In the wide open space of the training ground, loyal and strong figures suddenly appeared. They stood tall and straight, with persistent and respectful expressions. They stood up when the commander was in trouble, and were willing to take the responsibility they should take, instead of being a coward and putting all the blame on the commander. Nan 11 watched the scene quietly, and truly felt a strong flow of anxiety, fear, uneasiness, and tension. She looked at the almost identical begging faces of the soldiers of the Suanjia army and the Huainan army, and her heart was moved. She slowly turned her head and looked at Rong Yu. I have something to say. Her voice was not loud, but because of her special status, her words naturally carried a weight that could not be ignored. All the generals who had a say in the three armies looked at her without blinking, with a hint of tension and hope in their eyes. 11er Rong Yu pursed his lips, his eyes as gentle as water. What do you want to say? Although I don't know the reason for their conflict, and I don't know what the young master bet with you before he was willing to admit defeat, but the military camp is full of loyal men with iron bones. Nan 11's voice was light, and her calm tone was coercive. They defended their country and performed their duties faithfully. They were willing to take responsibility and were loyal and courageous. I admire them very much. Rong Yu said calmly, the country has its own laws, and the army has its own military regulations. Yes, Nan 11 nodded, but there are also human feelings outside of military regulations. Moreover, the military law that has been involved in the bet is no longer a simple and serious military law. I am here to plead for them. Rong Yu didn't speak. There is definitely a price to pay for making mistakes, but this price does not need to be so severe. Nan 11 raised her eyes and looked at Rong Yu. I think the number of 80 is a bit scary. Why not reduce it as appropriate? The Huainan army and the Great Zhou army were all refreshed when they heard this, and their eyes were bright. It would be nice if I could lose some weight. Rong Yu pursed his lips and remained silent for a moment, his noble and handsome face glowing with a cold luster. Under the extremely nervous waiting of everyone, he said lightly, how much weight do you think is appropriate, princess? Window. Tabula equals window. Tabula. Tabula.push, mode, thumbspeed -01, container, tabula below article thumbnail -300x250, placement, below article thumbnail -300x250, target. Type, mix. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. The regent is a yandere who needs to be pampered. Author, Nan Huang. Chapter 296. Your Highness is willing to accept defeat, which shows his integrity and gentlemanly demeanor. He is also willing to bear the punishment alone, which is a manifestation of his love for his subordinates, Nan 11 said. She saw the generals of the Huainan army nodding in agreement subconsciously, and a faint smile appeared in her eyes. I think that although the military law is strict, it is rare to have good character. How about a small punishment and a big warning? How about having the number of military sticks? Half. Chu Hongii sighed softly. Half is actually not bad. Although 40 sticks are not light, if the strength is controlled, it will not cause serious injuries. The king of Huainan has guarded Huainan for 20 years and has an extraordinary influence. This time, if his only legitimate son suffers irreversible injuries in the imperial capital when he returns to Beijing from afar, I am afraid that it will be difficult to explain to the emperor. At the critical moment when Princess Feng is about to ascend the throne, it is better to have less trouble than more. It is always bad to cause trouble. Rong Yu frowned slightly, as if he was not satisfied. However, before he could speak, several generals of the Huainan army could not wait to salute Nan 11 and said respectfully, "Thank you, Princess Feng, for showing mercy." Others naturally bowed their heads and shouted respectfully, "Your Highness Princess is wise." "Thank you, Princess Feng, may you live 1,000 years." The Huainan army thanked them together, their voices shook the sky, and a dull and exciting echo echoed in the barracks, making people feel a sense of vastness in their hearts. Looking at the momentum in front of them, it is enough to see the prestige and popularity of the Prince of Huainan in the army. The soldiers absolutely respect him sincerely. Military generals are different from civil officials. Most of them are straightforward. They like what they like and hate what they hate. Their submission and sincere respect due to their status and power can be seen from their words and deeds, and they cannot deceive people. But everyone knows that the current situation of Regent Rong Yu is difficult to get off the tiger. Faced with such a scene, He had no other choice. Princess Feng was the crown prince of Dongling, and Rong Yu was only the regent of Dezhou. In the military camp of Dongling, the crown prince's words naturally carried more weight, even if the regent was Princess Feng's husband. Yes, the Huainan army knew the relationship between the regent of Dezhou and the crown prince of Dongling. They all believed that the crown prince was respected, and the regent was the princess's minister, so he should naturally listen to the princess. So when Nan 11 spoke, they immediately thanked her, saying that they had already obeyed Princess Feng as the monarch and that Rong Yu must obey. In fact, they knew better than anyone that the military camp had its own rules. Even if Princess Feng was the crown prince, she had no right to interfere in the affairs of the military camp before she ascended the throne. If Rong Yu did not agree to Nan 11's request, she could not force him. That's why they thanked the princess immediately after she opened her mouth, forcing Rong Yu to agree under pressure, and they were also betting that the regent would obey Princess Feng, in front of so many soldiers. If he insisted on not changing his mind and not being soft-hearted, it would undoubtedly have a great impact on Princess Feng's prestige. The soldiers were looking forward to someone with a say to interfere in this matter, but they were also worried that the cold and ruthless regent of the Great Zhou would go against Princess Feng, so they did their best to support Princess Feng at this moment. Rong Yu remained silent. The longer the silence lasted, the greater the psychological torture for all the soldiers. After an unknown amount of time, Rong Yu said indifferently, "The military camp has its own rules, and Your Highness the Princess should not have interfered in the affairs of the military camp." Everyone was shocked. "The regent is wrong," Chu Hong'ai retorted calmly. "Princess Feng is the crown prince of Dongling, and the future empress of Dongling. The territory of Dongling is yours, and the people of Dongling are yours. Her Majesty has the right to interfere in all matters within the territory of Dongling. This applies to the court, and the military camp is no exception." A general in the Huainan army echoed, "General Chu is right. The soldiers and people of Dongling must submit to Your Majesty, be loyal to Your Majesty, and protect Your Majesty's country. In this situation, no matter how unruly they are, they will not be stupid enough to rebel against Princess Feng. As long as their own prince can suffer less, it is not too much to praise this princess to the sky." Others shouted in unison, "The people of Dongling submit to Your Majesty and protect Your Majesty's country." The voice was deafening, the momentum was magnificent, and it lasted for a long time. Nan 11's expression was a little subtle. She felt that this group of Huainan soldiers seemed very simple. However, her eyes accidentally fell on the kneeling young man in white robes. She didn't know if she was dazzled. The young general, who had been very calm from beginning to end, seemed to twitch his mouth slightly. Nan 11 was thoughtful. Rong Yu didn't say anything. When the soldiers' voices fell, the military camp was completely quiet. He finally let go. His cold tone did not reveal any emotional fluctuations. "Princess Feng has an order, and this king must obey it." The generals of the Huainan army were relieved. "Xian Yuanyao and Ling Fan will each be punished with 40 military sticks, and the others will be exempted from punishment," Rong Yu said coldly. "Do it." After the voice fell, the Huainan army was completely relieved. The soldiers of the Great Zhou Suanjia army also breathed a sigh of relief. Chu Hong'ai looked at the white-robed general, and deep thought appeared between his eyebrows. A strange feeling slowly fermented in his heart. The 4 soldiers holding sticks had no reason to delay any longer. 2 of them walked to Xian Yuanyao's left and right, and the other 2 stood beside Ling Fan. Rong Yu raised his hand to signal. The soldiers raised their hands, raised and lowered the sticks, and the heavy sticks hit the backs of the 2 men fiercely. From the sound of the sticks hitting the backs, one could hear the force of the blow. There was no let-up at all, and the beating was solid. Xian Yuanyao and Ling Fan both grew up in the military camp and were very familiar with military law. Although they did not look that strong, it was true that they were physically strong and naturally had a stronger endurance. But even so, The pain of being hit by a heavy mahogany stick was unbearable for ordinary people. After a few hits, the two men's faces began to turn pale, cold sweat oozed from their foreheads, and they unconsciously clenched their hands and held on tightly without making any sound. The military camp was so quiet that only the sound of the military stick hitting the back could be heard. Although it was broken in half, it still hurt, and there was still worry. The expressions of the generals of the three armies were tense, and they looked at the two commanders being beaten in the middle of the upper field nervously and worriedly. The regent is a yandere who needs to be pampered. Author, Nan Huang. Chapter 297. Your Majesty, something happened in the military camp on the outskirts of the city. Commander Yang, dressed in the uniform of a guard commander, hurriedly entered the Dajhan palace and knelt down on one knee. There was a conflict between the Huainan army and the generals of the Zhou dynasty. The emperor's expression changed. What's going on? King Huainan frowned slightly and looked expressionlessly at Commander Yang, who came to report. What happened? In addition to King Huainan, who was reporting on his duties, King Wei, King Jing, and King Huai were also present in the Dajhan palace. When they heard that something happened in the military camp, the expressions of the three princes changed and they couldn't help but glance at King Huainan. Did he cause trouble just after returning to Beijing? And he still had a conflict with the Zhou generals. What kind of behavior is this? They thought of the regent of the great Zhou dynasty, and suddenly looked forward to how this matter would be handled. It was the Huainan army who started the trouble, saying that the Suanjia army of the great Zhou dynasty was an outsider and was not qualified to enjoy the same treatment as the Dongling soldiers. Commander Yang tried his best to ignore the eyes of the Huainan king, which fell on him like a sword. The top of his head made him tighten his nerves unconsciously. The Suanjia army of the great Zhou dynasty was not convinced, and the conflict between the soldiers of the two armies intensified, almost to the point of violence. The regent of the later great Zhou dynasty arrived in time. At this point, he seemed to be hesitant. What happened after he arrived? The emperor frowned and said in a cold tone, how did he deal with it? If any trouble occurs in the military camp, it will be treated as a violation of military law. The commanders of both armies will each receive 80 military sticks. What? Both King Wei and King Jing thought they heard wrongly and looked at him in disbelief. 80 military sticks each. King Huainan's face suddenly darkened. He has an elegant appearance, a tall and straight figure, and has a strong pressure from being in charge of the army for many years. At this time, his face darkened, and a strong sense of oppression and momentum emerged from his whole body, making people feel palpitated involuntarily. The king of Wei frowned. The regent of the great Zhou dynasty has just arrived in Dongling for 2 days, why should he attack the general of the Huainan army? Commander Yang replied, the prince took the initiative to challenge the regent. The regent's condition for agreeing to the challenge is that if the prince loses, he must accept the military law. If the prince loses, then the regent himself will be punished with the 80 military rod. So strictly speaking, this is not an abuse of power, but an agreement to accept defeat. King Huainan remained silent, but his expression lost the coldness just now. He didn't know if he had confidence in his son's ability. The emperor frowned. What was the result of the competition? The crown prince lost. Commander Yang said. The regent ordered that the crown prince and General Ling, the commander-in-chief of the great Zhou dynasty, each receive 80 military staffs. After the words fell, the atmosphere in the Taisho palace became tense again. How is this possible? King Wei said with anger on his face. Are you planning to beat people to death? Prince Jing was also angry. This regent is simply lawless. He thinks he is in the great Zhou dynasty? Just because he is Princess Feng's husband, he can punish whoever he wants. He can punish whomever he wants. King Huai frowned. The torture staff used in the army is strong and heavy. If the 80-year army staff is used, I'm afraid. There is nothing wrong with the regent's handling, King Huainan said calmly, his expression having returned to his usual calmness. The military camp is an important place for running the army, with a large number of people and strict military discipline. If everyone is as willful as yandere, the military camp will how to govern. Several princes fell silent for a moment, and turned to look at him in unison, with surprised expressions. As the commander of an army, if you take the lead in making trouble, you should be punished. If you compete with others and challenge others, you should abide by the agreement and fulfill the bet. Only in this way can you maintain your military dignity, King Huainan said in a deep voice. Big the regent of Zhou now has a somewhat delicate status. He will punish his soldiers if they violate military discipline. But since the Huainan army took action first, of course he cannot just watch his soldiers suffer injustice in vain, he can maintain fairness and justice. A coach who stands up for his soldiers under certain conditions is a coach who is admired. King Wei frowned, but the king of Huainan stood with his hands behind his back, speaking calmly, he has just arrived in Dongling. If he really uses his relationship with Princess Feng as husband and wife to suppress the Dongling soldiers, the soldiers will definitely not obey him. The Huainan army will never cooperate with him without even meeting him. He would naturally not be convinced by this method of handling it. It would only lead to a more intense conflict between the two armies, and even lead to hostility between the two countries, leaving Princess Feng caught in the middle in a dilemma. His Majesty the Emperor fell silent upon hearing this, and the expression on his face gradually turned into deep thought. King Huainan is right. As a commander who has been guarding the border for 20 years, he manages the army well and naturally has rich experience in dealing with troubles in the army, so he can better understand the position of the regent of the Great Zhou dynasty. The army of the Great Zhou dynasty is indeed an outsider at present, but they are the guests escorting Princess Feng, not slaves who can be bullied at will. The officers and soldiers of the Great Zhou dynasty have the legendary General Rongyu with them. In principle, they are actually better than the soldiers of Dongling. More arrogant and conceited. The Huainan army was rude and provocative first, and the proud soldiers of the Zhou dynasty have been wronged. The regent Rongyu must not only protect the soldiers under his command, but also want the matter to be resolved satisfactorily. The person who provoked the first provocation must also get what he deserves. Punishment. Since power cannot convince people, they can only compete in terms of ability and conduct it in the form of a bet. At least the bet is based on the willingness of both parties, and no one forces anyone. The most important promise for a man in the army is that if the coach makes a bet, he must fulfill it. If the regent loses, then he will not be as skilled as others and will bear the sole responsibility for ineffective military management. He will have to bear the consequences of the AD army rod, whether he is unjust or not. And if the Prince of Huainan lost, the AD military sticks would be the punishment for causing trouble in the army, and he would be punished together with the chief general under Rongyu. Being beaten in front of tens of thousands of soldiers in the barracks, his status and momentum were suppressed by the regent Rongyu, and he had no choice but to accept it. The most important thing is that in addition to the resolution of the conflict between the two armies, the fact that the regent of the Great Zhou dynasty crushed the Prince of Huainan and beat him with 80 military sticks in public would become a fact known to everyone. With the ability and means, who else would dare to provoke him easily? The emperor sighed softly, deeply feeling that this direct and tough style of work was much more effective in governing the army than the roundabout intrigues of the civil officials, and it could also convince people. However, he frowned slightly. 80 military canes are still a bit too much. What if yandere is injured? Reporting to the emperor, Commander Yang bowed his head and spoke respectfully. Later, Princess Feng arrived and pleaded with the regent. The 80 military canes were reduced to half, 40 per person. The emperor was stunned when he heard this, and looked up at the king of Huainan without saying a word. As the father and son looked at each other, a thought emerged in their minds at the same time. Regent Rongyu, this is an opportunity to establish his authority to help Princess Feng win over the hearts of the army. The regent is a yandere who needs to be pampered. Author, Nan Huang. Chapter 298. Won't you go and see it yourself, my fifth brother? The king of Wei obviously didn't expect Xian Yuansheng to be so calm. Even when his own son was beaten, he could remain calm. No matter what the cause of the incident is, the regent of the Great Zhou, Rong Yu, and Yao are probably at odds with each other. Grudge? Xian Yuansheng looked at him expressionlessly, his eyes revealing a deep and unfathomable look that people couldn't understand. It's useless for me to go now, he said lightly. Those who should be dealt with have been dealt with, and those who should be beaten have probably been beaten by now. What can I do if I go? It's better to ask 2 imperial doctors to treat the injuries of Yao and General Ling of the Great Zhou. Hearing this, His Majesty the Emperor nodded slowly. That's right. Send 2 imperial doctors to take a look first, and let's talk about the others after they return to the palace. He then ordered the eunuchs to go to the imperial hospital to convey the order. Xian Yuansheng didn't say anything else. As soon as the Prince of Huainan returned to Beijing, he provoked the soldiers of the Great Zhou in front of tens of thousands of soldiers, and then was beaten with 40 military sticks. The news quickly spread throughout the imperial city, and the palace and the outside world knew the news, and there was a lot of discussion for a while. Everyone was shocked by the extraordinary courage and thundering methods of the regent of the Great Zhou. He even dared to beat the Prince of Huainan. Wasn't he afraid of offending the King of Huainan and angering the emperor, and he would have no place to stand in Dongling in the future? At the same time, they also learned that Xian Yuanyao was willing to accept the punishment because he challenged the regent and lost. But the civil officials understood things differently from the soldiers. They believed that Rong Yu had offended the father and son of the King of Huainan, and whether there was a bet or not was not the point. It is said that it was originally 80 strokes, and finally Princess Feng pleaded for mercy and reduced it to 40. So will the Prince of Huainan and the Huainan army be grateful to Princess Feng? Or, it is possible that they will hold a grudge together? The powerful ministers secretly sent people to inquire about this matter, wanting to know the attitude of the King of Huainan towards this matter, wanting to know the injury of the Prince Xian Yuanyao, and even more wanting to know how the emperor would deal with this matter. They even secretly speculated in their hearts, after today's incident, will the relationship between the regent of the Great Zhou, Rong Yu, and the King of Huainan become like fire and water? Will Princess Feng's situation become difficult? Most people only speculate about what has happened, and watch the development of the situation. All kinds of speculations and ideas are flying around, but no one thinks about why the Prince of Huainan provoked the Suanjia army of the Great Zhou as soon as he returned to Beijing. Among all the soldiers who witnessed the cause and effect of this incident in the military camp, perhaps only Chu Hong'ai had this doubt in her heart. Huainan King Xian Yuansheng guarded Huainan for 20 years, and he was strict in military management. He was not indulgent in teaching his only legitimate son. As his only son, Xian Yuanyao practiced martial arts since he was a child, was familiar with military books and strategies, and received the same training as the Huainan army. His father's requirements for him were even more stringent than those for other generals. Xian Yuanyao is a martial arts master. He leads the Black Obsidian army at the age of less than 20. It is not because he is the prince, but because he has strong enough military and political strategies and the ability to control his subordinates, which can make his soldiers convinced. Judging from his performance in the military camp today, Xian Yuanyao has a gentle and handsome appearance, and a humble and restrained character. Although he briefly revealed his unruly side, Chu Hong'ai felt that it was not the real him. She saw more of this young general who was open and honest, responsible, well-educated, and aristocratic in his words and deeds. Overall, he had no reason to make such a childish act of provoking and making trouble in the military camp. An outstanding military general is smart and sharp most of the time. Although they disdain the intrigues in the officialdom, it does not mean that they are people who can be fooled. At least in the case of Xian Yuanyao, she has roughly guessed a little truth. It's just that she won't easily say what she thinks. It doesn't take long to beat 40 sticks, and it's over soon. Chu Hong'ai reorganized her army and brought the soldiers back to the barracks of the Huben army. The soldiers of the Great Zhou dynasty quickly restored their usual order. The Huanan army was led by two trusted generals under Xian Yuanyao, who maintained the necessary rigor. The punished Ling Fan and Xian Yuanyao were helped into the barracks of the commander-in-chief, and were treated by the military doctor first. After the treatment of the injury was completed, Rong Yu handed Ling Fan a glass of water. "Thank you, Your Majesty." Ling Fan's face was pale and his hair was wet. "I'm fine, Your Majesty, don't worry." Rong Yu remained silent, his expression looked colder than usual. After he drank a glass of water, he said lightly, "Rest first, I will let Qing Yang take care of you." Ling Fan naturally did not dare to go against him at this time. He thanked him respectfully and lay down on the bed obediently. Rong Yu put down the cup, turned around and walked out. The guards outside the tent bowed their heads in fear when they saw him, and dared to stand up after he left. Xian Yuanyao's barracks were next to Ling Fan's, separated by two walls. When Rong Yu entered, the military doctor was still applying medicine to him. The young man lay quietly on the bed, with terrible swelling marks on his thin and tight back, which looked particularly shocking against his originally fair skin. Xian Yuanyao's personal guards served diligently by his side. The cold and chilly breath lingered around him. Xian Yuanyao turned his head as if he had noticed something. The sweat on his forehead had wet the pillow, and his eyelashes were wet. His pale and delicate face looked a little weak. The moment he saw Rong Yu, he pursed his lips slightly, his eyebrows and eyes subconsciously fell, and he said lightly, "You all go out." "My lord, the medicine is not applied yet." The personal guard's face changed, and he looked at Rong Yu with some vigilance. In fact, he was worried that Rong Yu would harm his lord. Xian Yuanyao said, "Go out." Rong Yu took the ointment from the military doctor and sat on the edge of the bed. "Go out, don't let anyone in." The guard had to agree. Although he was worried, he didn't dare to disobey his master's order, so he had to take the military doctor out first. The barracks fell into a brief silence. Rong Yu skillfully applied the ointment on the scars on Xian Yuanyao's back, not caring that the young man's nerves were tense, and his voice was indifferent and ruthless. "You didn't hit me enough. If it weren't for 11ER's words, I would have planned to break one of your legs today." Although he applied the ointment skillfully, he was not gentle, and even deliberately increased the strength. Xian Yuanyao was trembling with pain. I was a little impulsive, but I think this method can achieve the best results in the shortest time," the young man whispered, his voice trembling, "a little flesh wound in exchange for the obedience of all the soldiers in Dongling. This beating is worth it." The Prince of Huanan, who holds 200,000 troops, was defeated by the regent and knelt down to accept the beating. Others will only be afraid and will not dare to rebel again. Window. Tabula equals window. Tabula. Tabula.push, mode, thumbspeed -01, container, tabula below article thumbnail -300x250, placement, below article thumbnail -300x250, target. Type, mix. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. The regent is a yandere who needs to be pampered. Author, Nan Huang. Chapter 299. "So you just acted on your own," Rong Yu said in a cold and hard voice. "Did you get my consent?" Xian Yuanyao lay on the pillow, his sweaty fingers unconsciously grasping the quilt. The severe pain made his voice a little unstable. "If the master is still angry, wait until my injury is better, and then I will beat him up." Rong Yu didn't say anything, his noble and handsome face was as cold as if covered with a thin layer of frost. Xian Yuanyao was very afraid of him. Although he was very courageous when he provoked him on the training ground just now, he wanted to faint directly at this time. Unfortunately, This idea was probably impossible to realize, so he could only put on the most sincere attitude to apologize. I know I was wrong, and I will not deliberately provoke the master again in the future. Wrong, you didn't say anything. He was not a talkative person. At this time, he only focused on applying medicine to him. Compared with the cautious movements for fear of hurting the military doctor of the prince, the process of applying medicine was undoubtedly another torture for Xian Yuanyao. But even if he was shaking with pain, Xian Yuanyao would never dare to ask him to be gentler. After the ointment was applied to the swollen wounds, Rong Yu said calmly, Ling Fan was punished because of you. You have time to apologize to him. Xian Yuanyao was exhausted from the pain and responded half a beat later, yes. Don't bother with other things. I know what to do in Dongling. I don't need you to suffer flesh and blood. Rong Yu stood up, waited for the ointment to dry, and pulled the quilt over him. If you dare to be smart again, be prepared to stay in bed for a year to recuperate. Recruitment for a year? Xian Yuanyao was nervous and didn't dare to answer. Instead, he gently wiped the sweat from his face and turned to look at him. My lord, do you really plan to stay in Dongling in the future? What? Xian Yuanyao lowered his eyes. Is it worth giving up such a big country for a woman? The vast land of the Great Zhou is like a painting. How many people have tried their best and even stepped on countless corpses to get that position? He actually said to give up. Whether it is worth it or not is my business, not yours. Rong Yu said indifferently. 11 will become the queen of Dongling, and the king you will be loyal to in the future. If you dare to have any other thoughts, I will not let you off easily. Xian Yuanyao was silent for a moment, and said very cleverly, with the master here, even if I have two courages, I dare not have other thoughts. Rong Yu turned and walked out. Master Xian Yuanyao raised his head slightly and said seriously, the royal family of Dongling was forced to let Princess Feng ascend the throne because of the choice of the priest hall, so as not to let Dongling participate in the world's disputes. But the master should know that the situation in various countries has become tense, and the peace that has been maintained for hundreds of years is about to be broken. Now the kings of various countries can no longer suppress their ambitions. Even if Dongling is unwilling to participate in the world's disputes, it does not mean that other ambitious countries will let Dongling stay out of it. Rong Yu was silent, with a cold and distant expression. Princess Feng is a woman with a gentle and generous temperament. It is completely fine for her to be a wise ruler loved by the people when the world is peaceful. But if there is a war, Princess Feng does not have the courage to conquer the world. This is not something you should worry about. Rong Yu interrupted him coldly. It is your duty to abide by your duties and be loyal to the queen. This is your responsibility. The king will make arrangements for other matters. Xian Yuanyao pursed his lips, as if he had to get an answer. If Dongling is forced to fight, what will the master choose? Dongling will not. Rong Yu said, no one dares to send troops to Dongling. If there is only one way to die. After saying this, he walked out, obviously not interested in chatting with him anymore. Xian Yuanyao quietly lay back on the pillow and couldn't help sighing. Tough guy with tender feelings. It is really frustrating that the iron-boned god of war has become a softie. Wouldn't it be good to be the emperor of all ages who is admired by the people? With Rong Yu's legendary ability to conquer the battlefield, the powerful military force of the Great Zhou, and the loyal ministers and generals around him, it is only a matter of time to recover the territories of all countries in the world and create a powerful empire. If there is still one person in the world who can conquer the world and unify the world, it is only Rong Yu, no one else. What a great ambition, what a great feat that makes people's blood boil. Why must he hang himself on a woman? Xian Yuanyao was depressed. My lord, the guard came in and knelt on one knee beside the bed. Is the regent of the Great Zhou not against you? Xian Yuanyao said indifferently, no. The guard breathed a sigh of relief. My lord, do you want some water? No. Then. Don't make noise. Xian Yuanyao closed his eyes, let me be quiet for a while. Yes. Rong Yu walked out of the barracks and got on Nan 11's carriage. Yin Yu and Yin Shuang were sitting outside the carriage. Seeing Rong Yu, they saluted respectfully and then lifted the curtain for him. The carriage was very large and spacious. Nan 11 was sitting alone in the carriage reading a book. When she saw Rong Yu coming in, she smiled and put the book aside. Yin Yu lowered the curtain and started driving the carriage back to the palace. Have you been waiting for a long time? Rong Yu sat over and held her in his arms, then lowered his head and kissed her face. It's cold, don't go out alone in the future. Not alone. Nan 11 smiled, General Chu is with me. That won't work either. Rong Yu was dissatisfied, what if I get into danger? Nan 11 nodded obediently, okay, I'll try my best. Rong Yu bit her white ear, but today's situation is special, it's good to come, just take this opportunity to establish your authority. Rong Yu. Nan 11 raised her eyebrows, and looked at him with a pair of bright eyes. Is the Prince of Waynan an old acquaintance of yours? Rong Yu raised the corner of his mouth, why do you ask that? I have eyes to see, and a brain to think. She smiled lightly, if he really deliberately provoked and was hostile to the soldiers of the Great Zhou, Xian Yuanyao would not have such an attitude. Even if he really wanted to accept defeat, he should be angry and disdainful, not so, obedient. Yes. When she saw the young man in white robes for the first time, she noticed that his face did not have the expression of a deliberate provocation, and Rong Yu's words Xian Yuanyao, meet Princess Feng sounded more like an order, a very natural order. What was Xian Yuanyao's attitude after hearing this order? He was not rebellious, not unhappy, but just knelt down respectfully and saluted, without even saying a word of dissatisfaction, and was extremely humble from beginning to end. How could this be the attitude of a deliberate provocation? The regent is a yandere who needs to be pampered. Author, Nan Huang. Chapter 300. 11 Er is smart. Rong Yu raised a smile at the corner of his lips, you are worthy of being the queen. This sharp insight is beyond the reach of me. Don't talk nonsense. Nan 11 said coquettishly, you were clearly a cold and majestic look on the training ground just now. Why don't you pretend now? Rong Yu smiled and kissed her face, there are so many soldiers on the training ground. Even if I don't care about my face, I have to take care of the dignity of Princess Feng, right? Nan 11 was silent for a moment. What he said made sense. How did the Prince of Waynan know you? He used to train under me. Ah. Nan 11 was surprised, he trained under you. Rong Yu nodded, you were still young at that time. Young. Nan 11 was strangely quiet for a moment, and nodded thoughtfully, so, your power and the many loyal ministers and generals under your command, most of them began to accumulate after you went to the battlefield at the age of 14. The year he first went to the battlefield, Nan 11 seemed to be just about 10 years old, and she didn't even meet Gu Qingshu, but later, how could he allow her to like Gu Qingshu? Rong Yu nodded, not noticing the doubts that emerged in Nan 11's mind at this time, and said lightly, my acquaintance with Xian Yuanyao was an accident. Accident? Nan 11 raised her eyebrows, what do you mean? The carriage slowly drove towards the city, and even the sound of the wheels made people feel soothing and reassuring. The war that defeated the northern frontier had a great impact. The courts of various countries were secretly paying attention. The northern frontier was defeated, and my name soon spread in various countries. There was no lack of exaggeration, but it was a fact that one battle made the world famous, and after a victory, the eyes of the world gathered around me. Nan 11 hummed, and understood. The 9 countries in the world are independent. The strong countries pay attention to the strong countries, and the weak countries also pay attention to the strong countries. Some are for their own destiny and survival, while others are for realizing their own ambitions. If the king of a country is incompetent and the national strength is weak, it may become the object of covetous eyes of other countries. The strong countries keep a low profile and strengthen their troops in order to expand their territory and dominate the world one day. So the great Joe had a young warrior who killed the so-called barbaric and fierce northern frontier iron cavalry in just half a year. Even the first general of the northern frontier was beheaded. This incident shocked the world and shocked all countries, especially the kings and dignitaries of various countries. Xian Yao, the legitimate son of the king of Huainan, also paid attention to you at that time. Rong Yu nodded. After defeating the northern frontier, the victory report was sent back to the imperial capital, but the Suanjia army did not return to the capital immediately, but stayed at the border to rest for a while. When the general is away, he is not subject to the orders of the emperor. Besides, there are some things that cannot be done freely in the imperial capital, so we can only stay away from their sight. So under the pretext of resting the troops and adjusting the border defense, the troops and forces were left at the border, which would be much more convenient to do things. In the winter of the following year, after the war with the northern frontier ended, Xian Yao came to me with 18 followers. Rong Yu said calmly, with a sneer on the corner of his mouth. As soon as we met, the boy, who was only 14 years old at the time, said he wanted to challenge me without knowing his own limitations. Nan 11 frowned, calculating the ages of Rong Yu and Xian Yao in his heart. Rong Yu went to the battlefield at the age of 14. It was the winter of the following year, after the war with northern Xinjiang ended. He was only about 16 years old. Xian Yao is 2 years younger than you. Rong Yu was silent for a moment, and nodded uncertainly. Maybe. There may be some errors in age. I don't remember these things clearly. Nan 11 hummed, and no longer entangled these insignificant details. Anyway, he was only 13 or 14 years old when he came to me. He had a spirit of not admitting defeat and insisted on competing with me. Rong Yu thought of the past, and his expression did not seem to change. I can see that he grew up in the military camp. His style of doing things is very military, and of course he has the heart of a young man. At that time, Rong Yu's temper was more arrogant and unkind than now, and his methods were also cruel. If it weren't for his cruel and ruthless methods, he probably wouldn't have been able to make those soldiers listen to him at the age of 14, and then successfully take control of the military power and defeat northern Xinjiang. Although he was appointed as a general by imperial decree, he actually relied on his strong martial arts and archery to defeat the generals in the army, and then he successfully took charge of the military power. With his treacherous and changeable military strategies, he won the first victory of the war. The soldiers of the great Zhou dynasty were proud and naturally more convinced of him. Later, Rong Yu was strict in managing the army and never knew what softness was. The Suanjia army he personally formed suffered a lot under his hands. They really respected and feared this young general. In Qi Lin's words, he was full of evil spirits. Xian Yao found him at this time. Naturally, nothing good would come of it. The young man, who grew up in the military camp since childhood, was extraordinary, proud, and conceited, with a domineering arrogance, came alone with the 18 guards, just to see the world-famous young general. Rong Yu was busy with the training of the Suanjia army all day long, and had other things to do secretly. Of course, he had no time to pay attention to him, but the young man kept pestering him all day long, and he would break into the military camp whenever he had some free time, and he was determined not to give up until he achieved his goal. It's not that Rong Yu couldn't kill him, but the 18 guards around Xian Yao were all top masters. If they really had to fight, there would inevitably be innocent casualties. In order to solve this inexplicable trouble, he agreed to Xian Yao's challenge, but at the same time set a condition that if the other party lost, he must accept the punishment set by Rong Yu. Xian Yao could also refuse, and then Rong Yu would not accept his challenge. The young man traveled day and night from the Huainan border, 8,000 miles away, to the border between Dezhou and Beijiang, just to compete with this famous general. How could he be willing to lose this opportunity? So the punishment is punishment, no big deal. The first competition was in the military camp, many soldiers watched, and the 18 masters around Xian Yuanyao also protected him closely. The only people competing were Rong Yu and Xian Yuanyao. The result was naturally Rong Yu won. At that time, he did not really mean to punish Xian Yuanyao. He was even too lazy to pay attention to this person, so the punishment he gave was to let him go, the farther the better. But Xian Yuanyao was not convinced and insisted that this was not a punishment. With Rong Yu's temper at that time, how could he tolerate him again and again? He directly asked someone to bring a whip over, and in front of so many soldiers and the 18 guards, he set a punishment of 50 whips. Although the whip hurts, it does not hurt the bones. At that time, Rong Yu subconsciously did not intend to really hurt anyone. The 18 people were eager to protect their master and strongly opposed it. But Xian Yuanyao agreed, I took these 50 lashes, which means I will stay and continue to challenge you in the future.